We are here with Kelsey Bates. She is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in women's health and complex chronic illness. She has her practice, Women's CBT. She formed that in 2021, and that serves women in DC and also New York. She provides both group and individual therapy focused on issues like chronic illness, chronic pain, complex trauma, depression, grief, loss, and her entire practice is focused on bettering the lives of women impacted by complex chronic health issues. Kelsey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited too. We connected quite a while ago, so I'm glad to reconnect with you now.
Absolutely. And exciting that you guys have also grown to another location, I think, since we first met.
We have, and we've also added three more public health providers, so I'll need to connect
Amazing.
you with them as well,
Yeah, it's amazing. It's good for DC to have more folks to go to.
for sure. So our whole practice is focused on helping people stay exercising and stay active. So if you could only do one form of exercise for the rest of your life, what would it be?
I would do Pilates. That's what I
Okay.
tend to do almost. You can't see off screen, but I have a reformer in my office that I've just like fallen in love with reformer Pilates. um, I was growing up, I was a very competitive dancer, was in a ballet company. Like it's very hard to find an exercise that compares to like the joy of what that brought, which I don't know if you find that conversation happens a lot with your patients, but this is what I have found that kind of feels almost like a bar class in some ways that I find a lot of joy and it's good for my chronic pain and it's an exercise that I can actually do and enjoy. I think that's such an important part. Like finding something you actually like helps keep you more consistent.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's a great message because we have people all the time ask us like, what's the best exercise? And my answer, 100 times out of 100, is whatever exercise you enjoy. It really doesn't matter, what it is, whether it's dance or Pilates or CrossFit. As long as it's something you enjoy, then you're more likely to do it. You're gonna
Mhm.
have more fun doing it. You're gonna get more out of it. So I love that.
Absolutely.
So tell us, Kelsey, who's the type of person you like to help the most?
Sure. So my niche demographic tends to be young professional women that are really high achieving. I mean, being licensed in DC and New York, I've lived and studied in both of those places. So I get that those are both some really high achieving cities. Uh, and so a lot of times women in their 20s and 30s are coming in with a diagnosis that's totally derailed their plans. And whether that's career plans or dating, or maybe they're married and want to start having a family, or all of these things, they feel like, maybe they've planned things out pretty well in their mind and they have a lot of goals, and now they feel like it's not going to happen because of some illness or pain. So what I like to do is, say that there are tools, and there's a multidisciplinary approach, right? So I cannot help you with your physical exercise goals. That's why we need a PT on board or an OT on board. And they like cannot give you maybe the same mental health support and tools, right? That's why you got to need a therapist. You need an MD. There's so nutritionists. There's so many people that you could include. So I love seeing them thrive again. And pelvic health is typically a part of what they're coming in with. It's so whether it's pelvic floor dysfunction or it's a part of a systemic disease like endometriosis or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, they're coming in with different stories, different diagnoses, but like the path becomes the same, right? Their emotional experience um, is very similar, and all of these women feel very isolated. But there's a lot of women experiencing this as well.
That's great. I think that's important because the physical diagnosis can be a lot of different things, but often the emotional impact of 10 different diagnoses might be exactly the same.
Yes.
So, so how does a pelvic health diagnosis often impact women, and what struggles are they often dealing with? And I think it's important to talk about because a a lot of times women or men or whoever with pelvic health diagnosis might feel alone, and they might feel like they're the
Mhm.
only one feeling these things. So what are some common things that pop up when someone has a pelvic health diagnosis, or maybe doesn't have a diagnosis but are dealing with things that they don't know what to do with?
Yes. And like you said, I'll answer that last piece first. Maybe they don't have a diagnosis yet, but they come to me and they're like, I'm in a lot of pain. Maybe they can't have painless sex and they're, newly married or they're trying to date. I mean, that feels so isolating, right? So that's why I want to know, oh, I've got some great PTs in your area. Why don't you go? They can definitely give you some answers. So it's so important that mental health professionals also know their limits and people in the community that they can say, I trust this person and they can help get you some answers. But I see like a theme of isolation, right? They feel like they're the only one. There's such a taboo and stigma around pelvic health, although everyone has a pelvis. We all have this, and especially when it comes to maybe things that impact their reproductive health, like endometriosis. There's a lot of shame and grief, maybe about what that means for fertility, for having a family. There is a lot of similarities. And then just, I think a lot of sometimes anger, right? Understandable anger, like, why me? And it doesn't feel very fair. And we kind of operate in this way to get to more existential question of like, we can't answer that question, right? We don't, that it's doesn't feel fair. And how do we accept something that feels so unacceptable? But that is a big part of healing. How do we accept that this thing has happened? Um, and part of, I use several different interventions when working with these clients, but one of those is ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. So we are talking about what acceptance really is and what it's not. So acceptance is radical acceptance of your current reality, that this has happened, lean into it, but it's not giving up. It's paired with committed action. And I find that with especially, young professional women, very high achieving, they tend to maybe minimize all of the things that they're doing. But this is still a choice, right? I mean, they're going to PT, they're taking the medications, they're seeing new doctors, they're trying injections, they're doing all of these things. Um, but there's a feeling that like there's something wrong with me still and I'm not doing enough and I haven't fixed it. So I think when we view it with radical acceptance and radical compassion, we're able to say, no, look at all of the things that you're doing. Like, you don't have to be doing all of these things, but you are. And that's committed action that we have to pair with the acceptance, because we're not saying just give up and stop trying different exercises or different treatments. But there's also, we have to acknowledge the reality, right? And kind of lean into that so you can still feel joy. And there's still joy here, even if life looks different. But I think there's just a narrative of grief that I think maybe is not talked about. But at the end of that, we hope that there is some acceptance of things have changed, but that doesn't mean my life is over.
Great, that's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. That's definitely something that I didn't even know anything about, but has been very helpful for me in my mental health progress. So how would you say that differs? I think CBT is often more well known than ACT. How would you say that differs? How do CBT and ACT differ?
And it's really interesting because I feel like this is not even really a well-known thing, maybe within the counseling community, but there are three waves of CBT, and ACT actually falls under that third wave. So it's, I say old school CBT is talking about irrational thoughts and rational thoughts, and they're talking about, you know, reframing and all of that.
Kelsey,
Oh,
Kelsey,
did it?
Kelsey, real, yeah, it paused a little bit.
That's okay.
Um, so why don't we start with where I left off with
Sure,
tell
sure.
me the difference between CBT and ACT.
Sure. So it's not, I think, very well known, but through CBT is actually divided into three waves. So the first wave of CBT, started in the 30s. Um, it was very focused on behaviors, and I think that's still valuable, right? That behaviors serve a function. Um, all behaviors serve a function, and that way we can stop shaming the behaviors and just understand. So, like our avoiding, that serves a function. Like we can lean into that. The second wave came later, and then I think 19. I'm going to mess up the date, so I'll leave that alone. But that was more focused on the cognitive and emotional piece, adding to the behavior piece. Um, and that's like old school original CBT. The Ellis Institute in Manhattan does a lot of great work educating about this. I've trained there. Um, and I still think there was room to grow, because that irrational versus rational, that is really stigmatizing for people with trauma. And it's not always really accurate. If you're worried about a flare or going to the hospital because of that, because that's happened before, or an emergency surgery because it's happened before, it's not irrational. That's a trauma response. So the third wave, I think, kind of encompasses what was maybe missing there. And the third wave, Stephen Hayes created ACT, and we have DBT therapy under that umbrella as well. That they recognize the need to also have mindfulness and radical acceptance for things that we can't change. So I love utilizing all of those tools, because we do have to learn how to regulate our emotions, right? We've got to learn how to function at work and with our kids and with our spouses, with our families. Like, we have to learn how to regulate, but we don't want to dismiss the feelings, right? So it's always a balance. And we have to, you know, lean into more helpful thought patterns, but also have a trauma informed lens of, I totally get why this is a repeating thought for you, because that was traumatic, but it's keeping you stuck. And then we also have to acknowledge, like, all the committed actions. Like, you still have to have behaviors that push you forward. But with some pelvic health diagnoses, like, there is that hope for remission, right? Like pelvic floor dysfunction, and obviously you're the expert on this, but there is the hope for remission. Sometimes people are coming in with more complex, endo, EDS, they're not going to necessarily have a resolve. So that becomes, how do we accept that instability and find what is your new baseline? Because we can find a new baseline. So I think ACT and CBT really complement each other. Together, they're really the gold standard for chronic pain management and chronic illness. So I think when you're using all of the tools within all of the waves of CBT, you're not letting people fall through the cracks of feeling really dismissed. There's tools for all of them. And sometimes I find people really gravitate towards the acceptance. Like, they've been on this journey for a while, and they're like, yeah, I need to lean in. I'm ready. And then others are maybe newer, or they really enjoy that organizational aspect of CBT, and that helps them feel like they have more control, because that is an actionable thing. So I also find sometimes people get to choose, but that's nice about giving options. Like, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I myself, as a chronic pain, chronic illness patient, will not do myself. And I'm going to tell you, like, I kind of hate meditation, but I love this, right? And that's okay, but you might love it. So I think giving people options and choices is so helpful, because they have already lost a lot of options and choices.
Yeah, I think that's great. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think options and choices is awesome, because that's one thing that we really try to do. Because I find that people in pain, especially if they've been in pain for a long time, their world gets much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And in our world, often that's physically. I'm assuming in your world, that's socially, emotionally, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to combine both the physical, social, emotional piece, and just how do we make people's worlds bigger when they have a chronic pain diagnosis or even just a pain diagnosis,
Hmm.
and give them as many options as possible rather than say, don't do this or don't do that, or like keep taking options away because you might have a diagnosis of hypermobility or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. How do you keep expanding their world
Yeah.
instead of making it smaller? And I do think because I talk about, adapting your social world for this moment. Like for this moment, you might need to do more of those FaceTime hangs, right? Or you might not be taking the European vacation this summer, but you might be able to do a car ride to a mountain town you've never been to, right? Like, is that going to be the same? No. And I'm not saying it's the same, but just in this season of life, that might be where you're at. So that those things are better than nothing. And I do think, I mean, the pandemic changed so many things. I think one thing it did show is we are capable of being social far away, or if we're not able to be in person. Um, and I would love for that to be more normalized for folks with complex chronic illness. Like, I think I'm lucky with my friend group that it's pretty small, but they understand kind of my limitations and kind of where I can be. I'm very, 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 very lucky that I have that group of people, but it is small, and that's okay because that's kind of that's where I thrive, and um, that's where we all can support each other. I can still be supportive in my own way, and it might not always be face to face anymore. So again, it doesn't have to be forever. And I think that's another thing actually that I think is a misconception of acceptance is like, I've accepted this forever. It's like, no, this is just today or this week. Like we can't accept what we don't know. We don't know what will happen in a year or two or 5 or 10. So that that is a existential like concept that is hard, but we've got to really recognize where we can accept and where we don't know, and that is scary. But you have the tools to get there. When you cross that bridge, you have that tool.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that message of it doesn't have to be all or nothing is really awesome, and something we talk to people about all the time. Just
Mm-hmm.
because you're not doing everything that you want to be doing, or it's not in the perfect way, doesn't mean don't do anything.
Yep.
Or from our world, it might be somebody was a marathon runner
Mm.
and now they can't do that, so they totally give up running. Well, can you do 5 miles, or can you do even 3 miles, or can you ride a bike, or can you find something that replaces 60% of what you were getting before? And now that's 60% more than nothing. So we really try
Mm-hmm.
to help people understand 60% is a lot better than 0%. And then that 60%
Absolutely.
allows you to build back to closer to that 100%. So I'm assuming it's the same socially, emotionally, things like that.
Absolutely. And I love how like you're recognizing with your clients, it's not, I get it, it's not the same. I totally get it, right? But
Yep.
but this is better than nothing, and we've got to keep trying, keep pushing, and I think maybe sometimes people surprise themselves that okay, I it's not what I used to do, but I do find enjoyment out of it. And maybe then they can add in other things that are new interests, no matter what that is. They get to find, a kind of a new dimension to their interests and personalities. So there's a lot of, I think we just get so focused on like what I was and who I was. And I hear a lot about that, like the old me, and the old me was better. And I miss the old me. Excuse me. And I totally empathize. I totally get that. I'm always thinking as a patient first. Um, my life is not what I thought it would be necessarily, but man, there's a lot of amazing stuff I didn't expect that's here too. And I, it will, there is still joy, right? There is still, we just got to keep leaning in. So, yeah, I'm not the same as old me. You're not the same as old you, but that is the nature of being human anyways. We're just focused on the negative aspects of it, um, in that moment, right? Of like everything I've lost. And we need to grieve what we've lost, while making space for the possibility of new things to come into our life too.
Yeah, I think that's great. So, if someone is dealing with a pelvic health condition, or really any condition that's chronic pain, or is making their world smaller, and they feel that isolation, they feel grief of the life that they lost, what's one thing you'd recommend people could start doing today or tomorrow to start, you know, making steps forward?
Yeah, I would say you'd be surprised at how many support groups are out there, whether it's condition specific. There are a lot of either peer led or therapist led support groups available. Um, that those are so transformative because you realize that you're looking at a lot of people that are in the same situation as you that you would have never thought existed, right? And so I think looking for support group is something that could be incredibly powerful, is something that you could look at. Maybe the group's not starting for a little bit, but that's an action that you can take to try to find a bigger community. And this is similar, but I found a lot of joy in leaning into the activism part of uh, you know, societies of conditions that I deal with. And they're always looking for volunteers. And that's a very cool community because you're going to be around people that are not only in the same boat as you, that are dealing with the same condition as you, but they're there because they want change too. So, you have that beautiful balance of acknowledging the grief and let's let's fund research, like let's keep moving. So I think there are really powerful ways to channel that. um, that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think finding other people you can talk to is an awesome idea because again, it's very isolating to feel like you're the only one dealing with something. One
Mm-hmm.
thing we find sometimes with either support groups or online groups when it comes to physical pain is sometimes those groups often are very negative and a lot of people talking about um, the worst case scenario
Yep.
and they've never been able to get over it and it's a place where people um, can kind of vent because they don't have anywhere else to vent. So I find that people when they join a support group sometimes if it's that type of group all they're hearing is the negative side of things.
Yep.
So
Yep.
how can someone find a support group that might talk about the positive side of things or making the world larger rather than a support group that maybe makes the world smaller? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because I do get that feedback a lot of people that have maybe tried, uh, specifically sometimes more peer-led support groups, um, or things like Instagram and Reddit are really cool to be able to find resources and connect. um, every Everything can have a negative aspect to it, right? So there is the potential that you're going on message boards or seeing the stories of folks that are kind of stuck in their pain and there's not a lot of momentum forward of their own healing journey, and that can feel so discouraging, right? And it's on one hand I'm glad that there is awareness and activism, right? But it's hard for folks to, maybe they're looking for resources and they see a subgroup of folks that, like you're saying, that nothing has worked for them and now they feel pretty hopeless. um, my caveat is maybe start with looking for a therapist led group, um, because I run a group and my job, I tell them, is to keep you emotionally safe. And I'm not we're not going to talk our way out of your pain. I cannot promise that, but what I can say is you're going to leave with more tools than you came with. You're going to leave with more support and new friends than you had coming in, and you're going to leave feeling less alone. So that's a win. And like I said, there's no magic cure. There's this multidisciplinary approach for stability, whatever that looks like for your diagnosis and prognosis. But I think having a therapist to keep the group emotionally safe is very important. And there are amazing peer led groups. But if you find yourself in one that you're leaving feeling worse, just take a step back. Know that there are other options. And even, a DBT skills group can be so helpful for dealing, because that's a form of CBT, that can be so helpful for you to find other people dealing with really intense emotions or situations in their lives. There are lots of other options too, but finding somebody who can kind of help keep that emotional bandwidth in check is helpful.
I think that's great. I think that one of the last things you said there, it really resonates with me about a great message is if you leave feeling worse, it might not be a great resource. So whether it's a support group, whether it's looking up your condition online, whether it's the medical provider you're seeing, whether it's talking to your friends, like I think that's a great message for people to understand is you want to search out information that's actually empowering you and helping you, not
Yeah.
just searching out a community or information that's you make you feel worse about your condition or your potential or things like that. So I think that's a great message that, if you are part of these groups and every single time you're feeling worse, is that actually serving you? Or is
Mm-hmm.
it, can you find something that might give you a more optimistic viewpoint?
Absolutely. And I like that you're approaching that to everything, right? Like our time is so limited, your energy is so limited. And when you're dealing with physical health issues or mental health, like your time is, I think, your most important asset. So spend it in places that we don't want toxic positivity, right? But we don't need to swing over to the toxic negativity either. There is a happy medium and that balance. So absolutely. And it's okay to start over and try again, whether it be with a PT or a mental health therapist, maybe you didn't click. That doesn't mean it's not for you. It just means that somebody else is going to be a better fit for you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good message of finding the balance between positivity and negativity. And when you're dealing with pain, whether it's chronic pain, acute pain, big pain, little pain, it's not we don't have to minimize it. We don't have to say it's all rainbows and unicorns, but so we can acknowledge and say, hey, what you're going through really sucks, and
Mm-hmm.
it is hard to go through. But there's also these certain ways to look at what the potential is. So I think it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom, but it also shouldn't be minimizing what somebody's going through.
Mm-hmm. And everything that you're describing is that dialectical thought process. Like two opposites can be true. We can say this sucks, and that's your emotional brain, and we need our emotional mind. And on the other hand, our rational, logical mind can say, and we've got these steps to try to make it better. And we need both. If we're all emotional, we don't have any logic or ration. But if we're all rational, then we're just robots. So they work together. And I think just in general, that's a very hard skill for people to have a dialectical conversation about anything, but especially with ourselves and our lives and pain, like that's an important skill, life skill. So absolutely, if people hear this and take one thing away, it's that all of this can be true at one time, and that doesn't minimize your pain or change the capacity for your recovery.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a great place to end because my last question was going to be what message do you want to leave people with? But I think that's an awesome kind of thought for people to sit with and understand. And it's hard, but
Mm-hmm.
if you start to understand that both things can be true at once, it starts to get easier to start making steps forward.
Absolutely. And there's hope. I love your philosophy is there is positivity and hope while acknowledging this is really hard, but we're here for you. So
Yep.
I think I love your philosophy and the philosophy of your coworkers. I think it's really empowering.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Kelsey. So if people want to find out more information about your approach or want to hear more about your support group, where can people find you?
Yeah, if my website has a lot of information, that's www.womenscbt.com. That's women's with an S. Or you can check out same women's CBT that's on Instagram. Not as much information. I'm not as savvy on social media, but you can read a lot about the group and approaches on the website.
All right, this has been great. Kelsey, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jesse.